Hi, I'm Ken Paulson, the director of the Free Speech Center, and today we're going to have a very rich conversation with Professor Stuart Brotman. He's the author of a brand new book called The First Amendment Lives On. He teaches at the University of Tennessee, and he is a man who's written a number of rich books. This is one of his best. Stuart, we're delighted to have you.
Great to be here again.
I'm familiar with your work. You're one of the most knowledgeable people in the United States about the First Amendment, even though it pains me a bit to say that. We're proud to have you from the state of Tennessee, University of Tennessee, where he works in the communications and journalism field and has been prolific as a researcher and author. And I'm going to need some tips on how you manage your time, because the bulk of the sheer volume of what you accomplish is pretty amazing. You must be a steadfast researcher and writer.
Well, part of it is when I have traveled over the years, I've always maximized my time. So you will see me in airport lounges, you will see me working on planes. And I typically, before the digital era, had those legal pads. And so it was quite easy to just go off in the corner and be writing someplace.
And this book is really a great read. It's a vibrant experience, actually. I have the privilege of having known some of the folks, and you've captured their personality, their thoughts, their philosophies. But what I think most readers would be surprised by at the outset is that Hugh Hefner of Playboy magazine and Playboy Empire fame is really at the thematic center of your book. How is that possible?
Well, I always say that I never met Hugh Hefner. I never corresponded. So I had no personal relationship with him. And in some ways, I think that was beneficial in terms of this book. So unbeknownst to me, Hugh Hefner essentially compiled 3,000 scrapbooks during his life. And he started when he was about 16 years old, when he was a sophomore or junior in high school. And he ended shortly before his death at the age of 91. So for 75 years, he compiled a scrapbook. And he did this so religiously, I would say. Every Saturday, he would devote his entire day to what was called scrapbooking. And the way he would do that is during the week, he would clip different items or have review pictures or other things, and had piles that essentially were brought into him by his staff. And on Saturday, he would make an editorial decision what he wanted to put in the scrapbook. And he sat on a big round bed, that famous bed that people have seen. And he then had a manual typewriter. He used the same typewriter for 75 years. And he wanted to make sure that the captions would always be in the same font from that typewriter. And so over the course of those 75 years, he compiled a scrapbook. Not one scrapbook, obviously, 3,000 volumes of a scrapbook, and ultimately is in the Guinness World Records for having the most scrapbooks by an individual. And what's interesting about the scrapbooks, today we would call it a hard drive, but essentially they captured what he was thinking and doing for every week of his life. And on some of it, in fact, a lot of it dealt with Playboy and the enterprise he built. But what I found very interesting was you could also look at the scrapbooks and find an inner life and what he did or thought outside of the Playboy brand or empire. And then that was the part that I found very interesting. So I was given unrestricted access, the first person ever to be given unrestricted access to these scrapbooks. These scrapbooks were compiled for his own personal use. And they were kept in the Playboy mansion for many years and ultimately were moved into a storage facility in Hollywood, which is where I was granted access. And in the scrapbooks, I found a really interesting thematic consistency with his thinking about free speech and free press issues. And I was very taken by that to see 16-year-old Hugh Hefner and 60-year-old Hugh Hefner and 80-year-old Hugh Hefner carry those sorts of themes I call a DNA of the First Amendment. He really had this internalized. Some of it obviously was beneficial to the business he built, but some of it really had very little to do with the business. I mean, for example, he was a staunch advocate of student journalism, which of course had very little, in fact, nothing to do with Playboy magazine.
University of Illinois.
Absolutely. And he worked on he started a satirical magazine at the University of Illinois. I know you're a university, you're in Illini, but also he had worked on his high school newspaper as well. So I had worked on my high school newspaper. I had worked in college on media. So some of those experiences really resonated with me. And I saw he was not Hugh Hefner, Mr. Playboy. He was the same sort of person that I was when I was 16 or 20 years old. And that was very interesting. His daughter, Christy Hefner, in 1979, when she was initially working for her father, ultimately became CEO of Playboy Enterprises. Christy had the idea on the 25th anniversary of Playboy to have the foundation that was established by Hugh Hefner, called the HMH Foundation, to purchase the John Peter Zenger papers. And they purchased those papers and brought them around the country for display at libraries and museums. And they started a contest, an essay contest for high school students, what the First Amendment means to me. This is in 1978, 79. And at the end of the year, Christie had the idea that this was not going to be just a one-time event, that maybe what needed to be done was First Amendment awards needed to be established by the foundation, which would be given some to well-known journalists and celebrities who were staunch advocates, but also for people who had what I call a profile and courage for the First Amendment, people who had been whistleblowers or who had resisted censorship, who had been student journalists. And so for 40 years, over 40 years now, the First Amendment Awards have been awarded by the foundation to about 160 people over time. And I discovered that some of the most extraordinary thinkers and advocates in the field had in fact won these awards. And so I decided to then go out and have conversations with them, similar to when I saw in the scrapbooks, to try to get a sense of their First Amendment DNA. What brought them to where they are? How did their thinking evolve? Obviously, many of them were involved in seminal cases and other controversies. And so to have them really talk about that in what I call a head and heart way, intellectually, but also emotionally. And in order to do that, I went back and modeled the Playboy interviews. So Playboy interviews are almost a literary art form that were developed by Hugh Hefner beginning in 1962. First interview was with Miles Davis. The first interviewer was Alex Haley, who obviously went on to write Roots. And Alex Haley did a number of extraordinary Playboy interviews, including Malcolm X and a variety of other people. And so Hef had the idea of getting people to have these really deep conversations. And over the years, obviously, so many people did. He also wanted to use the Playboy interview as a forum for the marketplace of ideas. And so he had people who he did not agree with at all, politically, socially, philosophically, people like George Lincoln Rockwell, head of the American Nazi Party, George Wallace, segregationist from Alabama, Anita Bryant, anti-gay activist. Also had Germaine Greer and Betty Friedan. So all sorts of people, Bob Hope, Clint Eastwood, Milton Friedman, William F. Buckley, the list goes on. But literally the entire political and social spectrum was in Playboy magazine through these interviews.
So the interesting, in our college years, Playboy plays a major role, and the joke was always, well, I buy it for the articles. But the truth is, there were other magazines that were much more explicit, had many more pictures. Playboy was culturally plugged in like almost no one else.
Absolutely. And another aspect, because I saw that as a through line in the scrapbooks, he was very committed to investigative journalism. And I think a lot of people forget that there was a pretty consistent thread of good investigative journalism that was done in Playboy magazine. And he basically took money, obviously revenues from the magazine, and would hire an independent journalist and say, here's $50,000, here's $100,000, go out for 6 months or a year to do a story, which no other magazine, no newspaper would do. So the example I always give is Mark Bowl, who wrote The Hurt Locker. So much of the work of The Hurt Locker, the movie, essentially was developed by this investigative journalism of Mark Bowl at Playboy.
So who's the very first person you reached out to talk to?
Very first person I reached out after Christy Hefner to learn about, obviously, her father, and also much more about the First Amendment Awards, was Jeff Stone from the University of Chicago, who I did not know. Most of these people I knew by reputation, but I didn't know personally. And Jeff Stone is considered, if not the preeminent, certainly in the very, very, very top tier of First Amendment scholars. And Jeff is the former dean of the University of Chicago Law School, former provost, and interestingly, the author of what are known as the Chicago Principles, which are now used on about 75 campuses promoting free speech,
including the campus here at MTSU, we're proud to say. It's interesting, just in the abstract, talking about the book. So it's interviews with a number of people who have been honored by the Hefner Foundation, Playboy Foundation, and who have been, and who are very knowledgeable about these issues. But almost without exception, throughout it, there is an area of particular expertise, or there's one remarkable story, Floyd Abrams and the Pentagon Papers.
Yes.
Stone is interesting, though, because that interview covers so much.
Yes.
And I thought to myself, for a guy who is as storied as he is, and who has fought at least academic battles for decades, a particular focus is campaign finance reform.
Absolutely.
And for those who are not up to date on what's played out there, you know as well as anyone that a lot of people who you would normally think would be on the First Amendment side of the ledger are troubled by what the U.S. Supreme Court has said. Basically saying the ability to spend money to make your ideas resound to a wider audience is part of free speech. A lot of liberal supporters of the First Amendment are horrified by that. What was Stone's take?
Well, what's interesting is Floyd Abrams, because Floyd Abrams argued the case on behalf of Mitch McConnell.
Right.
And so it's been quite interesting because the book was not intended to be a conversation among and between the people that I have conversations with. But as you read the book, you can see that there is no orthodoxy in the First Amendment. There is great diversity. And that's another theme that, again, going back to the Playboy interviews, the diversity of thought and this idea of a marketplace of ideas. And so with respect to campaign finance, so Jeff Stone believes, and perhaps rightly, that we are in a crisis of democracy now. And if you're going to deal with the crisis of democracy, campaign finance is critical to confronting and dealing with that. And so I think he has a very widespread view of that. I think Floyd looks at it more narrowly in terms of having argued the case and believing that the result of Citizens United was a correct result. So there are two different conversations that are going on there. And I think if you have the book and if you read Jeff Stone and Floyd Abrams, you'll see sort of an implicit conversation that's going on between them, which I found to be very interesting.
It's fascinating in part because generally people who do what we do for a living can agree on whether a decision was a victory for the First Amendment or not. I can't think of another major so-called First Amendment victory that so many First Amendment advocates are uncomfortable with. It continues to be this ongoing battle within academia and the political sphere. What I've taken to telling people who say, well, that's just crazy, that money is speech. And even though I'm a little bit torn, I always say it's not crazy. There is a rationale there that makes perfect sense in terms of the First Amendment. It's not insane.
Absolutely.
You know.
Absolutely. And part of it is hearing the articulation of those arguments, which I think are quite interesting. And I think they're not done in a purely lawyer to lawyer syntax.
Right.
They're done in a conversational syntax. And so anyone could sort of pick this up. I mean, I thought of the book in another way, and going back to Hefner, he loved to have dinner parties and gatherings. In some ways, the book is a dinner party. I always say, if you could have Floyd Abrams sitting next to you, or if you could have Jeff Stone sitting next to you, what would that dinner conversation be like? And that's sort of what I tried to capture in the book, a dinner party conversation. And then once I had all of these people there, then people begin to do a little bit of crosstalk in the conversation.
So we were talking about Floyd Abrams. I think as much as anybody in your entire list here, he's been in the trenches. He has often been the guy who has to go into court to argue these positions. And the Pentagon Papers looms large in his professional experience. What did he tell you about that era?
Well, when I wanted to do, and I didn't go in the conversation with Floyd, I knew we were going to discuss the Pentagon Papers, but what I realized is Floyd had never actually had an opportunity to sit down and talk about the Pentagon Papers from the first minute that the case started until the case ended. And so I decided to essentially have a conversation within the conversation to get Floyd to tell the story of what I call the 15 days of the Pentagon Papers. And we all know what happened, but we don't know a lot of the behind the scenes of what happened there. And that was quite interesting. Some of it obviously may have affected the case. For example, Judge Gerfine, who is in the Second Circuit, who issued the injunction against the New York Times, part of it is he was a military veteran, and he believed that essentially military secrets needed to be kept. And he believed that not just judicially, but on a personal level. And that affected his decision, and they understood that. I think the other interesting thing I found out about the case, Floyd's professor from Yale Law School, Alex Bickle, who argued the case, had never argued a case in his life anywhere. Had never argued a court case. This is the first court case he had argued. And they worked on the case in in Alex Bickle's mother's apartment in New York. So he had these two guys and a few other lawyers against the Justice Department.
Wow.
And so there's a David and Goliath story, which is quite remarkable to hear, particularly from Floyd. And I think most of the people, in fact, all the people that I had conversations with are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. Floyd is in his 80s. And I consider them the greatest generation in the First Amendment free speech area. And so this was really the time to capture them. And all of them are still active in this area. So it's not as if this is behind them. And so I think I also got lucky in terms of the time I spoke to them. They are now in the position to be able to look backward and look forward at the same time.
So for those who are maybe students not familiar with the Pentagon Papers, fundamentally, there are documents that tell the history of the war in Vietnam, classified, but no damage. In fact, real benefit to the public to know what's in those papers. They're obtained by the New York Times, and the New York Times is ordered not to publish those documents, and then began the battle. And what I've always thought was a pretty heroic battle by the Washington Post as well, for jumping in and saying, you stopped them from publishing, and now here we come.
Absolutely. And in fact, that's how the case got to the Supreme Court, because the Washington Post had published and the New York Times was enjoined from publishing. And so that created a conflict that obviously had to be resolved by the Supreme Court.
Another fascinating case that resonates to this day, especially in an era